Okay, so first off, thank you to Babayit for hosting.
Of course, our pleasure.
And Chodesh Tov, everyone. Welcome to Adar. The class I've called tonight is Up is Down, Holy is Unholy. We're not going to talk a lot about Purim or Adar or whatever, but there's an idea that's become sort of associated with Purim, the idea of like finding holiness in the things that are farthest from what we typically think of as holy religion, etc. And I want to talk a little bit how we get there. Rather than even just focusing on that idea, it's going to be a little bit of like a tour. We're going to start at Vayikra and move from there to Hasidut, some of the opposition to Hasidut, and then to the more modern sources of Kook and Rav Shagar, talk about how we get to the idea of finding holy in dafka, what's not holy. So with that, I'm actually going to skip the first source, which is how I'm going to connect it to Purim at the end. We'll come back to that. I'm going to start with Vayikra. And source number 2 is Vayikra Perek Yud, from right after the incident with Nadav and Avihu, after they die, having come for whatever problematic reason into the Mishkan, the Kodesh Kodashim. Hashem appears to Aaron after the mourning process, and it says this is all. The translations here are either marked or usually from Sepharia. The Rav Shagar ones are my own, but the Vayikra ones are just whatever's on Sepharia. And the Lord spoke to Aaron, saying, "Drink no wine and no other intoxicant, you or your sons, when you enter the tent of meeting, that you may not die. This is a law for all time throughout the ages. For you must distinguish, Hebrew havdil, between the sacred and the profane, the unclean and the clean. And you must teach the Israelites all the laws which the Lord has imparted to them through Moshe." So this nevuah, this revelation, is like fundamental for setting up something that's really important throughout Vayikra and Halacha to this day, which is the distinction between Kodesh and Chol, Tamei and Tahor. The distinction between Kodesh and Chol is what essentially underlies like all of Halacha on some level. The actions that certainly this is true in Vayikra, but actions that are sort of participating in Kedusha in some sense, versus actions that are not, that are either, depending on how you want to translate chol, mundane, or even like profane, somehow opposed to holiness. And it's certainly true in Vayikra because like what's happening in these laws specifically, and this law specifically, is instructions for how a Kohen or Kohen Gadol can come into the Kodesh. Right? Entrance to the Kodesh is dependent upon certain forms of dividing between Kodesh and Chol. And this becomes really clear how this applies to the rest of Halacha in the next source. The next source is in the laws of Kashrut in Vayikra, which ends with a very similar sort of summarizing line. It says, "For I, the Lord, am your God. You shall sanctify yourselves and be holy, for I am holy. You shall not make yourselves unclean through any swarming thing that moves upon the earth. For I, the Lord, am he who brought you up from the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall be holy, for I am holy. These are the instructions concerning animals, birds, all living creatures that move in water, and all creatures that swarm on earth, for distinguishing, lahavdil again, between the unclean and the clean, between the living things that may be eaten and the living things that may not be eaten." So Kodesh and Chol is less emphasized here, but the same sense, like the whole beginning of this paragraph is about the importance of being holy. There's Kedusha again, but the sense of distinguishing actually becomes the basis for what we think of as kashrut. In Sefer Vayikra, it's very clear that like lots of the laws, whether it's kashrut or more obviously tzarat and the like, come down to issues of tumah and tahara. And this is sort of fundamental distinction between Kodesh and Chol and the question of what can enter into the Kodesh. And it's worth noting also in the Nevuah to Aaron, the Mishkan is called the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting. It's the purpose in some level, and this is the Ramban is very explicit about. The purpose of the Mishkan is a place where people can continue to meet God after Har Sinai. And the encounter with God is therefore wrapped up in this distinction between Kodesh and Chol and the ability to distinguish between Kodesh and Chol. What I get here is that, like, on some level, we have Kedusha and Kodesh and Chol. That distinction is about dividing our world into fundamentally like the things that are somehow put us into a relationship with God, either directly, like the place that's called the Kodesh, the Holy, where you could have some sort of meeting with God, or once it's a broader expansion out into the rest of Israel, outside the Kohanim, into actions that are commanded by God, or God says are good, that somehow you've put yourself into a positive relationship with God, versus actions and items, animals, whatever, that fall outside of that realm of the holy. So the fundamental starting place of all of halacha in general, and then Vayikra in specific, is this distinction between kodesh and chol. And that's important because so the Hasidut did a lot of interesting things, and one of the things it did, which its opponents attacked it for, as we're going to see, is it in many ways sort of undermined this distinction between kodesh and chol, this ability to make some sort of strong distinction. Here's a piece from the Baal Shem Tov. I think it's originally published in the Toldot Yaakov Yosef, but you can find it in the Keter Shem Tov, as I found it on, which arranges statements by the Baal Shem Tov by the Parsha. So this is for Bereshit. And it starts with a pasuk from Yeshayahu, which is very important for Hasidut. Malei kol haaretz kvodo. The whole earth is filled with His glory. Right? So if Kedusha and the distinction Kodesh and Chol was based upon saying some things are somehow more divine than other things, or some things are divine and other things are not divine, are opposed to God in some way, that already becomes challenged by the at least one way of reading this pasuk from Yeshayahu. But the Baal Shem Tov says, the whole earth is filled with His glory. Nothing exists, large or small, that is separate from God. Thus, a perfect person, Adam Shalem, can perform divine unifications even in physical activities like eating, drinking, and sexual relations, like business and mundane conversations between friends. Welcome.
The number's good.
Yeah, it's hard to find. Glad you made it.
Okay.
We're in source number 4.
Fine.
So the Baal Shem Tov is saying the Adam Shalem, because the whole earth is filled with God's glory, as it was the Adam Shalem, the perfect person can perform divine unifications even in physical activities like eating, drinking, and sexual relations, like business and mundane conversations between friends. And the whole question, what does it mean to a yichud, a divine unification? I don't want to get into that sidetrack, but on some level, it's about a unifying, for the Baal Shem Tov, it's about bringing the divine into the otherwise non-divine activities. We're seeing here that these activities you would not have thought are divine, like eating, drinking, and sexual relations, things that are not obviously connected to halacha, to classical categories of religion, ritual, can suddenly be a moment in which you encounter God, in which you experience something divine and participate in the divine.
Things that are classically thought of as non-God.
Yeah.
That's if you're Shalem.
What is the Adam Shalem can do this? Absolutely. He's not proposing this for everyone. So Hasidut is often thought of as a sort of very almost democratizing or egalitarian movement in terms of allowing everyone into the inner circle, but in many ways also really sort of hierarchical.
More of a modern. It's like Hasidut wasn't always.
There's also different parts of Hasidut and different a relationship between the ideas of Hasidut and its social structure, which is often very tightly structured around one person. It's all it's a much more complex story. It's a bit of a tangent.
The Ramchal, the Shiur Sharia, the last level, according to Ruach HaKodesh, I think it's just Kedusha. It doesn't do a divine unification, speaking of words, Kabbalah, but also has that all the physical activities that you drinking, sexual relations become elevated, like eating Kohen and eating Korban.
Yeah, this is
because we know that the Ramchal influenced Hasidut.
Yeah, and this is something that has its roots already in Chaim Vital's writings of the Arizal. Something that becomes particularly emphasized in Hasidut in many ways, and the Hasidut is also where there's going to be a much larger opposition that's suddenly going to appear to this. So he said, I have thus received a tradition from a wise man. I skipped some technical details about gematria and the like, or whatever, the structure of words. He said, this is the meaning of the verse, know him in all your ways, from Mishlei, Bechol darchecha de'ehu, which is like the other pasuk, and the man knew Eve, his wife, from the beginning of Sefer Bereshit, meaning unification and coupling. So he says the ability to know God in all your ways is connected to this idea of divine unifications, which he's connecting to the pasuk about marital intimacy, about the male and female coming together. That's important because for Kabbalah, there's a tendency to think of like our physical existence, this sort of world, as, in some ways, female as opposed to God being male, and that the Baal Shem Tov wants to get at here the possibility of bringing together our more material existence with God, and bringing God even into moments of eating, drinking, etc., that are not thought of as divine. So this, what's interesting is that the Baal Shem Tov sets this up, and this is exactly what we're going to see attacked in sources 5 and 6. But he actually makes a pivot from here to something that is entirely non-objectionable as far as I can read it. This is true about physical matters, all the more so with matters like prayer that stand in the heights of the world. There are many levels, and on each and every level a person can perform unifications in the mystery of thus shall Aaron come to the holy. Whatever level a person is on, from there he can include himself within the entirety of the world, which are on these levels. They are all the limbs of Knesset Yisrael. At this point, a person can pray, and it will be that his God be with him, and he ascends. So here is a pivot away from the Adam Shalem that you had pointed out before, the perfect person. That the way he concludes this is by saying, okay, so we've said that even in the most seemingly physical, non-divine actions, you can perform unifications, you can bring God into it in some way. So all the more so in tefillah, where there's all kinds of different people who have all kinds of different relationships with tefillah, and we're going to come back to this with Rav Shagar at the end, that you can everyone's actions can have God in them. Every form of davening, whether you daven fast or slow, or you say as little as possible. There's a story Chabad. I don't know if they attribute it to the Baal Shem Tov, but there's a story Chabad tells about the Baal Shem Tov that about Baal Shem Tov being in Shul on Yom Kippur when a little boy is crying out the Aleph Bet, the Baal Shem Tov says this is the greatest davening happening in the Shul right now, or because of this all the rest of the tefillot have some sort of value only because of the little boy saying Aleph Bet. This is the same idea here. It doesn't matter how you daven, he says. You can still have some sort of bringing God into your tefillah, regardless of what level your tefillah is at.
He shows it through the pasuk.
Yeah.
Bizot, the literal thing is, first of all, it's a little misleading translation. It's with thus shall Aaron come to the holy, but I think he means in thus, in Zot. In Zot, according to the Kabbalah, refers to Shekhinah, which refers to Knesset Yisrael. So, in Zot, if you are in this Knesset Yisrael, whatever level you're in, you can come to the holy. I think that's how he's reading the verse.
Right, so would you say being in Knesset Yisrael in this case means being part of the Jewish people, or part of the sort of meditative experience, or both?
The limbs of the Jewish...
The limbs of Knesset Yisrael.
Knesset Yisrael. The point is, I think his point is, in Zot, whatever level Zot has itself, the Knesset Yisrael has many levels. Whatever level you're on, you can cut through that, you can come to the holy. I'm pretty sure that's how he gets
I would say that. So I think he emphasizes that every level a person can be on. So,
right. But he emphasizes that they're all limbs of Knesset Yisrael. That's how he links it with the verse.
Yeah.
Generally the rabbis with a but. They can be in, with, on account of, so you can always play with it, whatever you want.
Yeah. Okay. But so that is in some sense, the movement the Hasidut makes. And it's worth noting that this, we're going to see in a second just how problematic this was seen as, but it is a pushback against what we talked about as Kodesh and Chol, as dividing sort of everything up into what you say is more divine or less divine, or more divine and opposed to divine. So I'm going to skip source number 5 for a second and jump to number 6. This is from Nefesh Chaim, Rav Chaim of Volozhin. Not the first opponent of Hasidut, but in some ways the most famous. He's explicit about having written this book, Nefesh Chaim, in opposition to Hasidut in the way it was teaching Kabbalah. Not necessarily because he disagreed. That's a debate to what degree he did or didn't disagree with, say, the Tanya. We're going to see some of the parallels, similarities, but fundamentally because he says they're teaching it badly, and people are getting the wrong idea, or people are getting the idea you should be like thinking Kabbalistic ideas all day long, all kinds of stuff like that. But we want to focus specifically on his critique of this sort of idea, this idea of finding God outside of halacha, as it were, or in non-typically religious activities. Or the idea of malay kol haaretz kvodo, that we can get sort of beyond this kodesh and chol distinction. So source number 6 says, and so it is that all of the fundamental principles of the Holy Torah, every one of the warnings and commandments, positive and negative, all operate within this context. That from our perspective, absolutely exist differences and variations between places. And places is a specific idea he's referring to in terms of like there are certain areas where you're allowed to say words of Torah, daven, etc. In a Beit Knesset versus in a bathroom where you're not. But talking in general, the fact of the real differences exist is fundamental for the Torah. In clean/pure places, we're permitted and also obligated to discuss and to reflect on Torah's words. And in filthy places, we are prohibited even to reflect on the Torah's words. And so it is with all the matters in the system of behavioral obligations that we are directly commanded in the Holy Torah, and lacking this context of our perspectives, there wouldn't be any room for the Torah and the commandments at all. That if you were in some sense to take really seriously the reading of malay kol haaretz kvodo as meaning the whole world is permeated by God or divinity or religious value, however you want to read it, all of Torah and mitzvot fall apart. Like the idea of distinguishing between things, havdil, we said was that the word from the Torah is fundamentally impossible. You can't distinguish between things anymore. So this is the critique of Hasidut, and part of what's interesting is that this is the critique of Hasidut has always been in many ways that their theology leads to throwing away the Torah. You don't need the Torah anymore. And it's worth noting that the Baal Shem Tov didn't do that. The Baal Shem Tov pivoted back towards Torah and mitzvot, that a sort of radical beliefs don't have to lead to radical practice, or the idea that you can find God in ways other than those traditionally expressed by halacha don't have to lead you to breaking halacha. Hasidut was a mix of people breaking halacha and not breaking halacha. Famously, we're going to look at a little piece from the Ishbitzer, Mordechai Yosef Weiner of Ishbitz, the Mei Shiloach, who's known for his drashot talking about how people broke halacha and God wanted people to break halacha. But Ishbitz is also sort of known for being very careful about halacha as a Hasidut. I want to look at the source number 5, the beginning of it, and then talk a little bit about what change has sort of happened here, even in the Nefesh Chaim, but how we think about Hasidut and halacha and Kodesh V'chol. But the source number 5. It says, but even considering this, these are his heroic and awesome works. To talk about what God sort of did. Even so, he hid, so to speak, his glory, so that it would be possible to actualize the matter of the existence of the worlds and power and created beings. So the Nefesh Chaim fundamentally accepts the idea of malay kol haaretz kvodo, that you can sort of find God everywhere. God is sort of all permeating. However, he says that God did this great thing where God hid his presence. In order to make it possible to actualize the matter of the existence of the worlds and powers and created beings, both newly created and renewed, having different qualities in diverse situations, distributed in different locations, places that are holy and pure, the opposite, impure and filthy. And this is our perspective, namely that our capacity for sense perception is limited to realities as they appear. And in this perspective, he built a system that mandates our behavior as we were commanded directly by him, it being immutable law. So the Nefesh Chaim, this is part of his explanation of what's in Kabbalistic terms called tzimtzum, sort of divine contraction, divine hiding, God concealing himself in order to make the world possible, in this case in order to make halacha possible. For the world to exist in some sort of form where halacha makes sense, where Torah makes sense, God had to sort of hide the fact that, really, you could find God anywhere in any sort of actions. Instead, God is concealed, and is concealed in our perspective. From our perspective, there are places where it would be problematic to say Torah, where you can't say Torah. And so, the Nefesh HaChaim, what he fundamentally says is that God made us sort of with that sort of perspective, and we're not supposed to be trying to get outside it. And that, in many ways, becomes the argument. The argument is, okay, we have this idea that you could find God anywhere outside of halacha, outside of typical religious categories. Should you be doing that? Or are we, in fact, really specifically meant to stay within the distinctions of Kodesh and Chol? Part of what I think is important here is that for both the Nefesh Chaim and the Baal Shem Tov, there's been a switch from what we call objective to subjective. That for Vayikra, Kodesh and Chol are objective categories. Those are facts about the world. Certain things are Kodesh, certain things are Chol. For both the Nefesh Chaim and the Baal Shem Tov, Kodesh and Chol are subjective categories. There's a lot of different ways to use the term, so I don't want to make too big a deal out of it, but they're part of our understanding. For the Nefesh Chaim, it creates a great distinction, mitzido, mitzidenu, from our perspective, from God's perspective. So from our perspective, Kodesh and Chol make sense. And what the Baal Shem Tov is saying is that, right, because we're already working on from our perspective and this sort of internal understanding, our internal understanding is what matters. That's why in anything a person does, no matter what objectively speaking you're involved in, what activity, thing in the world you're involved in, you can have that experience with God subjectively as well. So both of them have shifted the question of what's a religious activity, what does it mean to be involved with God, in religion, etc., to the internal realm. Questions, thoughts? We're doing a lot so far, but you guys are sticking with me, and thank you.
What?
I said thank you for sticking with me so far. We've done a bunch. There's two pieces here from the Mei Shilach. We're going to skip source number 8. We're just going to do number 7. I'll summarize 8 outside. Like I said before, the Yisrael is famous for suggesting in some way that people should break halacha sometimes, or that certain biblical figures did break halacha and that God wanted them to do so. So this was a piece from the Mei Shilach on Kitisa, discussing the prohibition of making idols, molten gods, as it were. And this is going to lay out sort of his understanding of how that works. And it's very closely connected to this idea of religions having become something internal or subjective, not a quality of the actions themselves. So the pasuk says, "Elohei masecha lo taseh lecha," molten gods you shall not make for yourselves. And the pasuk says, molten masecha refers to the general principles, the klalim. This is the meaning of the verse. What the pasuk means. You shouldn't make molten gods. It means in a moment when you have explicit understanding of the heart, then you should look not to the general principles to guide your actions. Understanding of the heart should be your sole guide as to how to act in each individual instance, as we find by Eliyahu on Har Carmel, as we explained well in Parshat Chukat. So what he gets into in the piece on Chukat, which is source number 8, is that the klalim are the general rules of Torah. We might call the objective rules of Torah. The Torah, laws of halacha, as we have them written down, as they apply to everyone, as God gave them. The typical distinction between Kodesh and Chol. But when you have binat halev, understanding of the heart, which in source number 8 he says, if your heart is drawn after the will of the blessed God, that's when you should follow that. When you have some sort of inner understanding that God wants you to do something, and that you can find God in this specific action, or I can see you thinking about it. But that's when you should follow your heart, as opposed to the objective rules of halacha. And what he gets into in source number 8 is there's a drasha in the Torah, drasha in Chazal, about the pasuk in Tehillim, eight la'asot l'Hashem haferu toratecha. It is a time to act for God. They are violating your Torah, which seems to mean that someone's violating the Torah. So the Tehillim is calling for the person to stand up. It's a time to act. We have to act against those who are violating the Torah. The way the Gemara reads it, or not on the Gemara, is it's a time to act for God. Therefore, break the Torah, which is how the Gemara justifies specific instructions by Nevi'im that go against what we might think of as halacha. There was a specific emergency situation required a temporary one-time or violation of the Torah. And the Meshiloach expands that to this idea of binat halev. Anytime you have some degree of binat halev, you should violate the Torah. That you have the Meshiloach has a whole worked out system because of this, about what does it mean to have a moment of inner clarity where you've managed to determine this isn't based on social pressure, it's not based on your own personal desires. You have to really know. But what's important is that this is when you can find God for Meshiloach. For Meshiloach, he has a lot of different ways trying to work out what is the Torah, this Kodesh V'chol distinction, because the real experience of God and the importance of what's a holy action, what's religiously valuable, has been shifted entirely to the subjective realm. So what happens to the objective standards of Torah? What do they mean? So some places where he talks about it as it's really all of Torah is about training ourselves, making ourselves better, refining ourselves. That God gave us this system of sort of refining ourselves in order to eventually get this inner subjective experience. Sometimes he talks about how you should keep halacha and then sort of learn to find this subjective moments inside objective halacha. But for the Meshiloach, he's moved past already the idea that sort of everything, even the objective stuff are divine, but the subjective is where we go find God. That the Baal Shem Tov was sort of talking about the subjective being the realm of divine unifications or experiences of God. And for the Ishbitzer, that's really it. If you want to have a moment of experience of God, some sort of religiously important moment, it's about trying to work on yourself internally until you can know that you're experiencing God and not just being misled by your own desires. And halacha might be useful for that or have some other importance, but that's where the emphasis is on religious things.
This is straight Martin Buber.
What? Oh, yeah.
Straight Martin Buber.
So I studied...
in I and that, that's what he says all the time. What is important is the kavanah, not the objective principle. It's what God demands. It's your perception of what God demands of you in this moment.
I should say...
You say it's a fig leaf. That Meshiloach says you have to observe all halacha to come to this. But in principle, I don't see any difference.
So it's a couple. I would say a couple things. One, I should just say that I studied the Meshiloach under Dr. Aviezer Cohen, who wrote his dissertation. Aviezer Cohen. Yeah, he teaches at Mechlelet Herzog, but he wrote his dissertation on the Meshiloach, and he compared the Meshiloach, put in dialogue with Kierkegaard, Rosenzweig, Buber, etc. And he really feels they're very much on the same sort of page. I thought
the whole issue about his publishing the book, no?
Yeah, it's a whole thing. I'm
surprised they didn't burn it.
Oh, the Meshiloach? Yeah, they did burn it.
They did burn it, okay.
They burned it not because of any piece we've seen today. There's a famous piece... it might be connected to the piece on Chukat. I don't remember. Zimri piece. There's a piece where he says that Zimri was right to sleep with a Midianite woman, but there's way more radical stuff in that. He says Pinchas was wrong, and he was like a child who does not understand the full truth. He also says, and this I think would be really radical today in a way that it obviously wasn't for the Meshiloach, that he says, why does the case? So he's now set up that Zimri was right, and Pinchas was so wrong that he was like a child. So why does the Torah look like it's the opposite? And he says that there's a din in the Gemara called a tangent called Shoda Dedaina, which is when there's a sort of gap in the halacha for an argument between who gets a piece of land, and there's no clear halacha who you get it. The judge can just pick. judge can say, it goes to this defendant or that defendant, except Rabbeinu Tam says the judge can give it to whoever he wants, whether one of the defendants, like one of the two people involved in the case, the litigants, or anyone he wants. So because of that, the Meshulach says, Moshe Rabbeinu gave the story in the Torah to his nephew. Nepotism shaped the text of the Torah we have it today. And I think that would be a lot more radical in today's context in many ways. Questions of divinity of the Torah is this was shaped by nepotism according to the Meshulach. But that's already, this is already off on a tangent.
It's machlokas for shooting the diamond.
Yeah, it's machlokas. Yeah.
It's pure or the general judgment.
Which
ironically would actually fit with the Meshulach.
He also has a more traditional Pinchas. Within the bonds of halacha, Pinchas did do the right thing.
Right. So that's why there's no clear answer here. Is that Pinchas was doing the right thing according to halacha. Zirmu was doing the right thing according to actual divine truth in that moment. It's very important that it's in that moment, because part of what's important for the Yisrael is that it changes. It's never something you could pin down in advance. And because there were those two different poles of halacha and sort of actual divine truth, Moshe Rabbeinu, there was no obvious right answer, so then he got to pick. Okay, but that's already quite a tangent. The goal I wanted to bring us to at this point in the shiur was certainly shifted to talking about God as something very internal, our experience of God. Our experience of God is something internal. Moments of great religious significance are things we think of as internal. I think this really matches up to our typical religious intuitions today. That we tend to think of things that are of spiritual significance, and I've shifted now to using the word spiritual, as being things that happen within us. Very much the idea of spirituality, which is, modern Hebrew connects it to a word going back to the Middle Ages, ruchaniyut, but in many ways is a very modern idea of there are certain actions or moments or whatever where I can tell that there's something of great significance happening here. And you might say that's a moment of relationship with God. You might say it's a moment of transcendence, whatever. People use all kinds of different terms nowadays, but the moment of a sense of subjective religious experience is something that's grown a lot and comes out of this same sort of moment as of Hasidut, what Hasidut is thinking about the subjective, the importance of the subjective experience of God in religion. So with that, I want to look at a couple of pieces, one from Rav Kook, two from Rav Shagar, and Rav Kook is going to sort of continue this trend of the subjective experience. Rav Shagar is going to try of spirituality, of trying to have a spiritual moment, and that's where God is. And Rav Shagar is going to take us past that in a way. They're both of these are Rav Kook and Rav Shagar are very deeply in dialogue with the Baal Shem Tov we saw before, very deeply drawing from the Baal Shem Tov, but in slightly different ways. So Rav Kook, this is from a text called Musar Avicha, translation by Rav Arizev Schwartz. I think this is his book, The Spiritual Revolution of Rav Kook. I think these are some of the best translations of Rav Kook out there in terms of understanding Rav Kook and making it very clear. Part of that is that he tends to be a little less literal. You might notice you compare these to some of the other translations, or if you know the original Hebrew. But I think it does the job, and it's really useful if you're not so familiar with Rav Kook.
When did it appear?
What?
When did it appear?
I'm thinking 2017, 2018.
Okay.
Pretty recently.
Recently, okay.
Yeah.
It hadn't kept up.
It's put out by Geffen Publishing.
Uh-huh.
So in all your ways, know him. The same pasuk we saw before. Bechol drachecha de'ehu. The Baal Shem Tov uses. One must search for God in everything one does. When praying, one must search for God by trying to focus on the words of prayer with deep concentration and a dedicated heart. One must not search for gods in other matters at that moment. Indeed, while involved in that specific action, it may be said that God can be found within that action and nothing else. When studying Torah, one must realize that God is found in the very act of analyzing and trying to understand each idea. At that moment, God reveals himself in that specific action and not in anything else. And finally, when involved in Gemilut Chasadim, acts of kindness, one must search for God by trying to uncover the best possible way to help one's friend. This principle is true in all actions that a person does. Do not all matters in the world uncover the divine? Therefore, everything a person does should be understood as a mitzvah, because one must search for God in every action. We may accurately say that one who dedicates his or her entire mind and strength to performing every action with the greatest level of perfection knows God in all his ways. So the Rav Kook is in many ways restating, with a twist, restating what the Baal Shem Tov said, that you can find God outside the realm of Torah and Halacha. You can also find God there. He talks about studying Torah, doing Gemilut Chasadim, but it's the subjective aspect of your involvement with any given action that means it's a moment where you can know God, where you can have some sort of encounter with God, or unification with God. And the way you do that, as opposed to for the Baal Shem Tov, where he talks about sort of Kabbalistic ideas, is more what you might call mindfulness or being present. For Rav Kook, to have an encounter with God within a specific action is to bring all of yourself to that action, to be totally present in that moment and not thinking about anything else. This is what I'm doing. Mindfulness? I said it might be called mindfulness. I know that a lot of different things people call mindfulness, so I don't know. I'm not an expert. But yeah, arguably it's mindfulness.
Like the Baal Shem Tov.
What, the Baal Shem Tov? Baal Shem Tov, it depends on how you understand the Kabbalistic Yuchadim and stuff, and I don't want to get into details about the arguments about that. But for Rav Kook, it's very clear. It's about...
what are Yuchadim? Is that just like the same Yichud?
Is it the different versions of it? And definitely for the Baal Shem Tov, one very important aspect of it is sort of bringing your whole self to it, and being very attentive to what's happening to you. But I'm not sure I would say it's like the same thing. There are, mystical ideas of names and God and things that come into it more. Sorry if that's unsatisfying.
I'll have to look it up.
Yeah. Right, so for Rav Kook, no matter what you do, you can know God in every way, in everything you do. And the way you do that is by having, like I said, we might call some form of spiritual experience. That there's a moment of presence, and that is sort of how you encounter God. So part of what I want to talk about though here is that this, in many ways, while Hasidut was in many ways challenging the Kodesh V'chol distinction, I think Rav Kook, and particularly in the wake of the Meshiluach, in some ways reestablish a sort of Kodesh V'chol distinction. So I call this section of the sources Kodesh V'chol 2.0, spiritual versus unspiritual. This is really true for the Meshiluach. I should have put Meshiluach in this section. For the Meshiluach, if you have Binat Halev, you have an inner experience of God, that's an action that's, kadosh. And if you don't, then it's not. Actually, there was a phenomenal piece of Meshiluach on the discussion of Migdal Bavel. This is Migdal, what was the language they spoke before the Tower of Bavel? Was Lashon HaKodesh, right? But he says, what's Lashon HaKodesh? He says, Lashon HaKodesh is any time you're speaking from that in a language that really expresses who you are inside. When you are speaking authentically, that's Lashon HaKodesh. And if you're speaking inauthentically, that's not Lashon HaKodesh. You're distracted, you're parroting something someone else said. That's not holy language.
That works because when God created the world, He used Hebrew, traditionally speaking. So if your language is authentic, it's creative, it creates from a deep place.
Yeah, that
like a godly act.
No, it's definitely a wonderful read of the idea of like language as a creative thing. This is definitely worth checking out. The Rabbi Nachman Likutei Moharan teaching Yud Tet. He talks a lot about relationship with the idea of Lashon HaKodesh. For Kol, he mentions the idea of creation. But certainly, I was trying to remember if I'm remembering from Rabbi Nachman or Rav Shagar. Rav Shagar's teachings on this talk a lot about that idea exactly. But I think the clear sense of when you have a spiritual experience, that's something kodesh, and when you don't, it's something chol. And that creates, similar to how in Vayikra, kodesh and chol create distinction, and the nefesh chaim, these are actions you should strive for, these are things you should try and avoid. It creates a sense that we should be aiming for spiritual experiences. You should always try and make your davening a spiritual experience, make your tefillah, you're learning Torah, spiritual experience, you're doing mitzvot, you're even doing chasadim. And for Rav Kook, that doesn't have to mean, you're just thinking about God the whole time. You're very present in that moment. You have some sort of important inner experience of what it means to be religious and to have some sort of experience.
You're saying it's like, if you're speaking authentically, you don't have to be talking about anything holy whatsoever. You could be just, I don't know.
Yeah, no, ordering a coffee, but you're doing so, like, if that's where you happen to be in your heart of hearts, so that's the holy act. What's it called? The Baal Shem Tov mentions on his list of things where you can perform Yichudim, just mundane conversations, and that's a whole discussion within Hasidut, the idea of sichat chulin, of mundane conversations, and most typically somehow the mundane conversations of tzaddikim or chachamim.
You want to overhear, the Rosh Yeshivas, when you're in yeshiva, you want to overhear your rabbis, like, you want to hear them have one of those sichat chulin, like crave hearing that.
Yeah. And so the question exactly of like how you learn from that, or is lengthily discussed in Hasidut. Rav Tzadok, I know, has many pieces trying to describe like how you derive religious value from mundane conversations or the mundane conversations of Hasidim, of tzaddikim, specifically in rabbis. But for sort of in Rav Kook's sense or the Meshulach sense, it's a matter of being very present in your whole sort of authentic self, bringing that to the conversation.
Yeah, but I mean, Meshulach is much more radical. But he said
the Meshulach is very radical. There's no question.
I think Rav Kook, you might say, is breaking down the distinction between mitzvah and reshut.
Yeah.
Because he said because normally you have things which are the mitzvah, which is somehow defined, and then the reshut, which obviously he's supposed to do for the sake. Things you're not commanding, you're supposed to do with proper intention. But he said that already makes it a mitzvah.
Yeah.
So he breaks that distinction.
Yeah, that's true. The Meshulach is, I don't want to say the most radical because I might be missing something, but definitely the most radical I know of in this sort of idea. I'm not as familiar with some of the continuation of Rajin that's also in that area. The student Rav Tzadok goes back and forth, is a little more ambivalent about these kind of things. Okay, so that in mind, I want to talk about Rav Shagar. Rav Shagar, I think, is really interesting that he is, one of the things he's famous for is emphasizing the idea of personal meaning and finding meaning in Judaism, Talmud Torah, etc. But he also, I think, has a very keen sense of the idea of, we start with the of Malay Kol Aretz Kavodo, of the whole world being full of God, the sort of what it really means to speak about God as being all pervasive. It comes up in a variety of areas. And it comes up one of the areas in discussion of subjective meaning and the importance of, or lack thereof, of subjectivity within sort of religion. So I have two pieces here from very different contexts. The first one is from a discussion of bitachon. He started the question of like, what's the proper degree of human action versus God? What should we be depending on God for? And what should be done via human action? And he spends a lot of the piece, before the passage we're going to see, talking about a very passive stance of bitul, of just saying, we don't do things, we accept things from God. Whatever God does, it comes from God, we can just totally accept that. And then he makes a turn, and he says, actually, he's basing this on some Chabad writings from Hillel of Parich, but he talks about here in some ways the idea of bitul, which he says the idea of seeing God as being sort of all-pervasive and nullifying your own sense of separateness, leads to a different conclusion. It's going to lead us back to the world, to the sense of like practical actions. I'm going to read this and then explain. So it's a little dense. Because paradoxically, The logic of self-nullification leads to a parabolic movement, culminating in a return to the world. Parabolic meaning out of the world and back in. The righteous person nullifies himself, but in this, the lack of nullification, the non-spiritual worldly life, itself becomes nullification, a vessel for infinite light, an instance of existing but not in existence. Nimtza v'lo b'metziut, from Hebrew translations of the Rambam. The divide between creator and creature, between a righteous person and his creator, blurs. So the non-spiritual worldly life itself becomes a vessel for the infinite light. So he started by talking about the sort of more spiritual approach, you might say, where you say everything that happens is from God. I don't need to do anything. I just sort of accept the divine things happening to me. He says if we really take seriously the idea that God is in everything, then it doesn't make any sense to say God is in all the stuff that happens to me, but not in the stuff that I do. Right? God is also in the non-spiritual life, the world of human activity, the world where I am the one driving things that happen. That if the Baal Shem Tov wanted to undercut, in some sense, the objective Kodesh V'chol, that Kodesh V'chol as like facts about the world, Rav Shagar wants to do something similar with the idea that of the Meshilach, that Kodesh V'chol are found within ourselves, of the question of are we totally present or authentically experiencing God in that moment or not. Because even at a time when we don't feel like God's there, God is in our very sense of God not being present, of absence, of alienation. And so he's, I think, in some sense, tuning back into that same instinct of Malei Kol Haaretz Kivodo, that God is bigger than all distinctions between holy and not holy. And then the piece I want to end with, I'll come back to the Purim for a brief moment, but is a piece about tefillah. He actually doesn't talk about sort of divine pervasiveness here, but he's trying to get at the same sort of idea. He talks about it in terms of brit. That a brit is something that includes all of who we are. This is from his discussion of Likutei Maharan. He says, similarly, Rabbi Nachman's understanding of Tikkun HaBrit does not depict the Brit as identification. Identification meaning an inner experience of, I identify with this thing. This thing makes sense to me, I like it, etc. Identifying with something still expresses a dualistic consciousness because a person could identify with something outside of himself. Brit, meaning you're saying, I identify with this moment of this text I'm saying in tefillah. There's you in the text of tefillah, and you identify with it. Brit means getting rid of duality. So being overly aware of what we're doing ruins it. For example, we say thank God, and that immediately traps us as if we're doing something good by saying thank you. We can free ourselves from this trap by saying thank you from a place of linguistic oneness, of simplicity, pshitut. And I'll go back and explain all this at the end. If I pray, I must identify with the prayer, then this is still a matter of innerness and duality. The highest prayer is simply saying, speaking. This act can create the most delightful prayer. So he's trying to get us towards a place of saying it's not just about what I feel inside that matters. That creates a distinction between the inside and outside. That even just the act of davening without real kavanah. And he's not getting into here the halachic question. Here's a really interesting passage he talks about where he quotes. He talks about what you put on tefillin. If you need to have kavanah for it, if you're in a shul, based on the Mishnah Berurah. But he's talking here about the idea that if a brit includes all of ourselves, even the parts of us that aren't paying attention, that aren't being totally present in the moment. And the same thing would be true in the logic of Malei Kol Haaretz Kivodo. If God is found even in the moments when we don't have kavanah, then we should matter less to emphasize so much the internal aspect. Anyway, traditional language, you might say the idea of mitzvot anashim malumada, of doing mitzvot out of total routine, is itself something that can be very divine. Rav Shagar likes to talk about mitzvot as a way of life, halacha as a way of life. And the nature, I think, of building your life around something is that it's not all going to be moments of presence and deep spiritual experience. Sometimes you daven while you're waiting for a bus, and sometimes you shake lulav while your kids are screaming at you. It's an experience I had this year, which is uniquely interesting. But you don't have totally spiritual experiences, and on the level of religion and Kodesh is about having moments of subjective encounter with God. You're really missing something there. It's for the Meshiloach, it's a total moment of chol. But for Rav Shagar, there's a sense of recognizing that even when you don't experience God, God is present in that. There can be religious significance to those sort of actions and activities, even if they lack this spiritual dimension. An unspiritual moment can still be Kodesh. I also say part of what this might do, and Rav Shagar doesn't go there explicitly, it might return us in many ways to the objective standards of Kodesh v'chol. Once it's no longer as important to search for God in spiritual moments, in moments of subjective religiosity, then objective standards become valuable again. In some ways, we saw some messages where he becomes critical of the Meshiloach of this a little bit. The Meshiloach is working with this tight distinction that doesn't actually hold up. Of it's only when you're really being authentic and really having a encounter with God that you can find Kodesh. He says, no, you can find Kodesh in doing mitzvot and going to Yom. He talks about davening on Yom Kippur and feeling like nothing's changing. We're gonna do this again next year. It's gonna be the same, and that's still just fulfilling a mitzvah. There's moments of kedusha there. And in terms of Purim, obviously this is. None of it has been explicitly related to Purim, but this is the same instinct you hear talk about a lot in Purim. That Purim is there's no mention of God in the Megillah and stuff like that. And there's a famous idea that people talk about. It originates from the Gemara in Megillah that I quoted here about when it says the king's sleep was disturbed. It means that God, the king of the world, his sleep was disturbed. You'll hear people say every time it says the king in the Megillah, it really is sort of a secret reference to God. There's a couple of ways to take that, I think, based on what we've said here. That you could say, when it refers to the king, you should sort of undercut that and realize that that really God is sort of the true meaning is God behind the picture, the scenes is organizing everything. Or you can say that even the so unspiritual, unholy thing of the king Achashverosh doing things, making his own totally not based on religious or holy motive decisions, his decision to have a party or his trouble sleeping, is itself in some sense divine. You can find God even in that. Thank you for coming. Any questions? Thoughts? Okay.
Thank you.
All right,
Rosh Chodesh Tov. Thank you again to Vayikra for hosting.